Okay, so Ananda. Yeah, I thought it'd be a good opportunity to devote the evening to Ananda. He's such a loved and revered figure, even today. So, and he played such a vital role in preserving the Buddha's teachings and passing them on for future generations. Don't expect me to sort anything out that's technique. I just about turn my phone on. It's about my limits. Yeah. And I'm sure most of you, over whatever time we've been about, will have looked at Ananda and perhaps done some study on Ananda. So the stories of Ananda do vary. So when you're hearing this tonight, you know, there will be variations, but they kind of carry the same sort of message. Yeah. And the name Ananda means bliss or joy. Yeah. So Ananda, a bit of background, he was the first cousin of the Buddha and served him with loyalty and love for 25 years. And Ananda was regarded as the best in learning, memory, goodness, and resolution. Yeah. So Ananda was a good old sort, a good old all-rounder. He was famous for his gentleness, humility, and an extraordinary memory. He was able to memorize the Buddha's discourses by heart, you know, which would take some doing, wouldn't it? His retelling of these discourses formed the basis of the Tripitaka, literally the basket of teachings. So if you hear the phrase, "Thus have I heard," which opens each sutra or teaching, it signifies that what follows is considered to be a text recited by Ananda at the first council following the Buddha's death. You often hear that, don't you? "Thus have I heard." So that's what that's about. So it is said that Ananda was born on the same day as the Buddha. I've heard a few different versions of that, so I know who knows. And in the same caste, the warrior caste of the royal family of the Shakyans. Ananda's father, Amitabhadana, was the brother of the Buddha's father, Suddhodana. So the two cousins grew up together in the Shakyans' capital city. So they would have been around, well, if that's to be believed, they would have been around each other from birth, kind of grew up together. He was his, well, yeah, he was his first cousin, so they were close. So when he was 37 years old, Ananda joined the Buddha's order of monks, proving himself to be a willing and diligent pupil. So during the first years of his life as a monk, he was completely occupied with the purification of his own mind. So during a rainy season retreat, after hearing a teaching on the 5 skandhas, I will very fleetingly tell you, for those that aren't, probably most of us know what the skandhas are, but I'm not going to be sitting here talking about the skandhas. So this is just to let you know what the 5 skandhas are. So form, the body, matter that is tangible, what can be touched. Sensation, feelings, so experiencing through the 5 senses. Perception, the process of recognizing what things are. Mental formation, so our thoughts basically, and consciousness and awareness of things. So just to let you know what the 5 skandhas were. So anyway, during a rainy season retreat, after hearing a teaching on the 5 skandhas, Ananda gained stream entry. So that's the point where there's no falling back from stream entry. You're going to be kind of moving forward towards enlightenment. I suppose in a nutshell, the 5 skandhas are the different parts that come together to make a human, in a way. So when the Buddha and Ananda were both 55 years of age, the Buddha called a meeting. He wanted a trustworthy and reliable attendant. And all the disciples offered their services. They all wanted to do that. But Ananda didn't put himself forward. He modestly held back. He was very modest and didn't want to be pushing himself forward. But the monks encouraged him to volunteer. He was asked why he didn't volunteer. And he replied that the Buddha knows best. The Buddha knows best who is going to be his most suitable attendant. And Ananda had full confidence in the Buddha. And the Buddha declared that Ananda would be his attendant. But Ananda's relationship to the Buddha was not just that of a servant. He was a friend, a companion. He was a secretary. And there was a great deal of warmth between them. So great was Ananda's mastery of the Dharma, the Buddha spoke of him as a living embodiment of the teachings. He had a prodigious memory, and having spent most of his time with the Buddha, he was very learned in the Dharma. A lay follower once asked the Buddha how he might honor the Dharma. So this was in an age where the Dharma wasn't written down, hadn't been written down yet. And the Buddha said, if you wish to honor the Dharma, replied the Buddha, go and honor Ananda, the guardian of the Dharma. The Buddha told the monks that it would not be easy to find one who equals Ananda in wisdom. And these verses that I was reading today kind of speak of that. If one wishes to understand the Dharma, one should resort to such a one who is of great learning, a bearer of the Dharma, a wise disciple of the Buddha, of great learning, bearer of the Dharma, the guardian of the great seer's treasure. He is the eye of the entire world, deserving worship of great learning. So you can see just in the few words I've said, Ananda was very special, really. So the Buddha saw Ananda as the best of all his attendants, the foremost of all those monks who had ever filled this position before. So in 3 of the verses in the Tathagata, Ananda sums up the way he served the Buddha through the last third of his life. And this is what Ananda says. For 25 years, I served the Blessed One. I served him well with loving deeds, like a shadow that does not depart. For 25 years, I served the Blessed One. I served him well with loving speech, like a shadow that does not depart. For 25 years, I served the Blessed One. I served him well with loving thoughts, like a shadow that does not depart. So there's a story of a time when a wild elephant is deliberately let loose in order to kill the Buddha. I don't know by who, but Ananda throws himself in front of it, ready to die, rather than let the Buddha be killed or injured. And 3 times the Buddha asked him to stand back, but he wouldn't. He was prepared to sacrifice his life for the Buddha. Eventually, the Buddha persuaded him to move out of the way, but he was prepared to do that. And I've been thinking about that quite a lot, and I thought, would I have been prepared to do that? Would I have been prepared to throw myself in front of a raging elephant? Not sure really. But yeah, so that might be worth thinking about in groups. Not that there's many elephants about, so we haven't got to concern ourselves too much. But yeah. Above all, Ananda filled the role of a good secretary, facilitating smooth communications between the thousands of monks and the Buddha. I mean, that would have been a big job, wouldn't it? You know, because even though these monks were all practicing, there still would have been all the stuff that goes on, wouldn't it? Together with some of the other monks, he tried to sort out and attend to the various problems that occurred in the community. Ananda played the important role of clarifying doubts and keeping order, often acting as the go-between for the monks, maybe arranging an audience with the Buddha for them. So he was playing that role, wasn't he? You know, with the Buddha in mind, he was trying to sort everything out around him. So Ananda was seen to have 5 qualities. One who has heard much, who has learned much. One who has a good memory. It is said that Ananda remembered all of the Buddha's discourses. One of them who had sequential structure of the teachings, so he understood them and followed the logical order of the teachings. One of those who was steadfast in study, and he was the loyal attendant of the Buddha. So these 5 qualities all stem from mindfulness, sati. Sati is the ability to remember. And Ananda had this ability on an astonishing level. He immediately remembered everything he heard, and didn't just remember it, but understood it. Even if he'd only heard it once, he could repeat discourses of the Buddha perfectly, up to 60,000 words. And as I said, he fully understood the meaning and significance of the teaching with all its implications. So even when interrupting, Ananda could be kind of repeating a discourse of all these words, and somebody could interrupt him, and he could just pick up from where he left off. And he was completely dedicated to the task at hand. So Ananda could be relied upon to preserve the treasured teachings so that they could be passed down through the generations to the monks and to their pupils, and eventually to us. So sometimes Ananda reported certain views of his to the Buddha so that the master could either accept them or correct them. You know, and that was quite something, wasn't it? Ananda, he would take something to the Buddha that he thought needed corrected, and the Buddha obviously listened, and sometimes that needed to happen. So once he approached the Buddha and said, "It seems to me, Lord, that good friendship is half of the holy life." Unexpectedly, the Buddha disagreed. "Do not speak thus, Ananda. Noble friendship is more than half the holy life. It is the entire holy life. For what would the holy life be like if they had not all come to the Buddha as their best friend to be shown the way?" That's one of the questions. I must be honest, when I was first around the movement and the word Sangha was used, and that Sangha is the whole of the spiritual life, and I really struggled with that, I must be honest. I thought, if the Sangha is the whole of the spiritual life, maybe, anyway, that could be something it's looking at in the group. I just thought, if it's the whole, will I find a way in? Kind of did, a bit of an odd way in. Anyway, yeah, so I think that might really be worth looking at in the groups. So once Ananda saw an archer perform extraordinary feats, and he was very impressed. And the Buddha used this to draw an analogy. He said it was more difficult to understand and penetrate the 4 noble truths, i.e. the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the end of suffering, and the truth of the path that leads to the end of suffering, than to hit and penetrate with an arrow a hair and split it 7 ways. That's how difficult it is. So when the Buddha was moving towards his death, Ananda became deeply distressed. He went to his room and stood lamenting, saying, "Alas, I am still a learner with much to do, and the teacher is passing away, who was so compassionate to me." The Buddha on his deathbed noticed that Ananda was missing and sent a monk to get him. When Ananda arrived, the Buddha consoled him, saying, "All compounded things are subject to decay. How could he not die?" Then he encouraged and praised him. So Ananda stayed with the Buddha until the Buddha's death. He saw the passing of the Buddha and felt huge sorrow. So he went to the forest to meditate. But when it became known that the Buddha's attendant was nearby, he was absolutely inundated with visitors, people who wanted consolation. They wanted something from him. And Ananda, even though he was grieving himself, responded fully. So shortly after the Buddha's death, the first council was convened. Ananda had attained enlightenment just before the council started. He played a pivotal role in this first council, reciting many of the Buddha's discourses and checking them for accuracy. I mean, I wish I'd said more about this, but he also came under criticism at the time for allowing women to be ordained. But he eventually, which is a story in itself, established a nuns' order. So he is one of the most loved figures in Buddhism. It is said, and who knows, that he lived until he was 120. He died 20 years after the Buddha, but he's just remembered, revered, and really loved to this day. So, so that was why I particularly wanted to dedicate this night to him, because, yeah, he's special.